Welcome to the weekly Health RX by Arvasi. I'm Dr. Avanti Kumar Singh.
And I'm Dr. Tanmeet Sethi. We're physicians trained in modern medicine and experts in Ayurveda. And each Sunday, we cut through the noise with physician-led, science-backed prescriptions personalized to your biology.
From your hormones and gut to your circadian rhythm and nervous system, we'll help you take care of the systems that matter most so you can stop guessing and start feeling better. Finally, medicine that fits you. Hello and welcome. This is your weekly Health RX for the week of February 22nd. I'm Dr. Avanti Kumar Singh.
And I'm Dr. Tanmeet Sethi. And we are so looking forward to being with you again this week. But before we dive in, we still feel like we want you to hear us, that we're acknowledging that even though we're talking about mood and all the things that play into that with your dosha and imbalances, midlife transitions, there's still, just a lot going on in the world. And that's all happening on top of what's happening in your body and with what's happening in your body. And so remember that we are here to give you tools, not to bypass or say that this is going to make everything okay, but that your real emotions, the appropriate responses you're having to the real world, are real and valid, and you deserve some nourishment for your nervous system and some nourishment to show up in a way that feels more resourced. So we're going to continue giving you those tools to help navigate this world. So we just want to acknowledge that.
Yeah, I think that it's so important for us to remind ourselves that, but also to remind all of you that really what we want to do is give you tools. And, I think it's so hard sometimes when you are a physician and you're wanting to help people, that people don't think that you're trying to just focus on the science and the physiology and the health pieces of it, of what you traditionally think of as health, but that this is really about understanding that this is real life. And there are so many other things that go on in our lives that directly affect our health. And I think for me, that's really an acknowledgement of we can give you all of this information, and also what's happening in the real world in your life is one of the biggest factors that's going to affect your health. And that's really important for all of us to keep in mind.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And so, with that, we're just going to hop in. And remember last week, we went deep on why your mood may feel like it shifted. Those brakes that are worn, that thermostat that might have become more sensitive, and how your specific dosha determines your specific anxiety pattern. And so hopefully many of you tracked your patterns this week and started to see when the anxiety or irritability hit and what might have activated it, because that observation matters. And today we answer the question we hear most, which is, what do I actually do when it's happening? So today we're giving you those pattern interrupt protocols, prescriptions for in the moment when anxiety spirals. Not so much daily habits necessarily. This is a little different. It's when that anxiety just hits, when you feel that irritability flaring. What do you do in those first couple of minutes to interrupt the pattern? Thinking about those first 60 to 90 seconds almost.
Yeah, and I think the important thing here is that, it's really how do you address it right in the moment? Because you cannot think your way out of anxiety. And I think so many of us feel like, okay, I'm just going to stay calm. I'm just going to breathe, right? I'm not going to get worked up. And these are all important things to tell yourself. But in the moment, you're not going to be able to think about all those things. So what can you do, right? You can't think your way out of the anxiety, out of a nervous system irregularity or dysregulation. Again, your first instinct, I know for me, is that when the anxiety hits, it's to say, okay, I'm going to talk to myself. It's not that bad. I need to calm down. I'm overreacting. But when your stress response has already been activated, right? Your prefrontal cortex, that thinking and reasoning part of your brain, is not available, right? In that anxiety moment. That's just how your body works. The alarm has already been activated and it's taken over everything. So it's kind of like, I think about having a conversation with someone who's irrational. Like, let's say it's a child who's having a temper tantrum because they're just so upset, and you're trying to reason with that child. and they're just so upset, crying hysterically, and there's no way you're going to get through to that kid. It's sort of the same thing. Like your brain is just not online. You can't get through to it in that moment. So, it's really what can you actually do that is not about thinking your way out of this. And so what we're trying to do here is target your physiology, not your psychology. Because I think so much of what we hear in the wellness world is trying to address your psychology all the time, but that's not how it works in your body and your biology. So that's really what we want to talk about today.
Yeah, exactly. And so to understand how and why these practices work, it's helpful to understand first what's happening in your body. So when you experience anxiety or irritability, there's actually more of a cascade, not a single reaction. There's a sequence that builds over time. And understanding that cascade is the key to interrupting it. So we can think about it almost like 3 different phases. So if we think of it that way, then phase 1 is the alarm, right? Like within seconds of a perceived threat, and that is not always a threat, like a tiger or a gun or something. It's a headline. It's the way someone talked to you. It's a thought. Then your sympathetic nervous system releases adrenaline and noradrenaline. These are your immediate stress chemicals. Heart races, muscles tense, senses sharpen, and you're not even consciously processing what's happening. Your body's reacting first. And then there's phase 2, the escalation. And this is really important because over the next 20 to 40 minutes, maybe even a little longer for some people, cortisol begins to rise. And cortisol is the sustained stress hormone that you hear about. It keeps the body in alert mode long after that initial alarm. And that's why it's so hard to, quote unquote, just calm down after something activates you. This chemistry is building and building. And then we get to phase 3, which is really the critical part of this cascade, which is the reactivation loop. So, here's what matters most. The cascade doesn't just fire once. Every time you reengage with the stressor, whether that's actually reengaging with it, the boss who you don't like or whatever it is, or replaying the argument in your head, or hitting refresh on your scroll or your news feed, all of that initiates a whole new phase 1 surge, a new alarm on top of an already escalating phase 2. And so the cascade layers and layers and layers. And that's why something that someone says to you at 10 a.m. can ruin the entire day. It's not necessarily that you can't let it go. It's that every time you return to it in some way, your body's actually layering on that cascade. And I actually think of it like this. I feel like all this sort of language around like let it go is kind of demeaning and disempowering because what it's saying is like you should be able to let it go with your mind. But what I'm going to tell you is that if you understand the cascade I just went over, your body is the thing that's holding on to it, not your mind. Your body is. And so that's why interrupting this physiology, as Avanti said, is so important.
Mm-hmm. And that's why you can't think your way out of it, right? You can't just tell yourself, let it go, just breathe, just calm down. Those things don't work in the moment, right? And so, the other thing that we need to think about is why, this midlife time amplifies this cascade, right? So remember those breaks in the thermostat that we talked about last week that the Meath already referenced, right? There's a way that they're connected to this stress cascade that the Meath just talked about, right? When you were a little more hormonally balanced, and that's just because you're in this midlife stage where the hormones are not as balanced, that's just physiology, right? This cascade actually can self-regulate a lot better, right? Estrogen is working better to inhibit the HPA axis overreaction. Progesterone-derived neurosteroids will help to support the GABA function, that calming signal from your brain, those breaks we talked about. But in perimenopause and menopause, like in this midlife time, there are some things that actually change that then affect the stress response or the stress cascade, right? First, your thermostat is more sensitive. Your HPA axis is actually more reactive because you have fluctuating estrogen. Things that may have not registered before as a full alarm response are now causing a full alarm response, okay? Second, the brakes are a little weaker, right? GABA is a little bit weaker. That regulation that happens by GABA will start to decline a little bit as progesterone declines. So you can't slow that cascade, that stress cascade, as efficiently as you could before. Third, and this is probably the most important, is that your recovery takes longer. Your clearance of cortisol takes a little bit longer. So your system is staying activated longer. It's also what Meet was talking about, that we stay in this sort of reactivation mode a lot longer. And so reactivation is even more likely. A sensitive thermostat plus weaker brakes means that repeated cascade activation can happen a lot easier. And so this is why, again, you might be a little more snappy. You might be scrolling more, even when you know it's making you anxious, right?
Exactly. So, if you can't think your way out, what can you do is what you might be asking. And that's where these pattern interrupts come in. So a pattern interrupt works by engaging the parasympathetic nervous system, that counterbalance to that whole stress cascade. And so when you intentionally shift your physical state, you're sending a signal to your nervous system that we're not under threat right now. Now, we want to be clear about what pattern interrupts do and don't do. They don't instantly clear stress hormones. That doesn't happen. Adrenaline and cortisol don't vanish because you took a breath. I wish it did, but it can do critical things. First, it can stop that reactivation phase that we were talking about by interrupting the actual reactivation, right? And you allow that existing cascade to naturally decline rather than layering on new ones. Secondly, it activates the vagus nerve, which is the longest nerve in your body and the main nerve of your parasympathetic nervous system. So specific practices actually can stimulate the vagus nerve, which is the primary pathway, and that's a counterbalance to what's happening. And third, it creates perceived safety. Your nervous system responds to that. The body doesn't distinguish between a real threat and a perceived one. And a pattern interrupt creates the perception of safety, which allows the body to begin returning to baseline. Now, I want to be clear that sometimes you aren't safe, right? And in that moment, it would be actually impossible for a pattern interrupt to do that. What I'm referring to are situations where we are feeling unsafe because of a threat emotionally or a thought that we're having or news or the world that isn't actually creating danger in the moment, but our mind is perceiving it that way. Understandably, but that's very different than a real actual threat. All right. So that's why we use specific time markers in these prescriptions, where we say things like 90 seconds or, 5 breaths, not because they're based on chemicals magically clearing, but because they're based on creating a container that's doable, making an endpoint that makes it easier for your nervous system to relax.
Exactly. And that's why we think it's so important to really personalize these pattern interrupt protocols, right? Generic stress management, as they would call it, treats everyone the same. They say, just breathe, count to 10, take a walk. These aren't wrong. These are good practices, but they're not as personalized to your biology, to your sort of emotional responses that you have because of your constitution, right? Everyone responds to things a little bit differently. So, for example, if your anxiety pattern is more of racing thoughts, a pause alone might not be enough, right? You need something more than that and something different than that. If your pattern is more frustration and irritability, something that is more activating as a practice might actually make it even worse, right? So there are different ways that you can actually do a pattern interrupt that actually matches your biology, your dosha much better. And that's why we've created these very dosha-specific pattern interrupt protocols.
Right. And so that's why, in those specific prescriptions, you'll get those step by step for your biology. And those are part of our paid subscription. And if you haven't taken the dosha data assessment yet, go to mayurvasi.com. We'll link to it in the show notes. It only takes about 5 minutes. And once you know your dosha, you can start to understand your biology better. So, this week's dosha prescription will give you one specific practice, the exact thing to do when your anxiety pattern hits. Not theory, the actual practice, okay? And next week, we'll talk about news and scrolling and your personal nervous system. It's a big one. Because in Ayurveda, what you take in is not just food. You take in everything through your senses. So we'll show you what that means for your dosha. All right, friends, that's your weekly Health RX for this week. Until then, be well.
Thanks for listening to the Weekly Health RX by Arvasi. Be sure to subscribe on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen so you never miss your weekly prescription.
And make sure to take the Arvasi Dosha Data Assessment at myarvasi.com, linked in the show notes, so you can unlock your biology and get your own personalized weekly prescription.